Welcome to another episode of the Enspiral podcast. Today I'm here with Nick. Thank you so much for making the time. Good to see you. And we're connecting from other sides of the world. It's my first podcast with a person in New Zealand. Feeling so happy.
No, it's good to be here.
And there is something really cool that you created for our handbook, which I was feeling like so super grateful. I wish this would have been there when I was joining Enspiral, which is a guide to newcomers. So kind of a document helping new people in Enspiral to actually land in the network and find their own place and not get too frustrated with it. And maybe I would like to start with the very end of the guide. And I read this message that there's quite a lot of like churn in the sense that people join and after a year or a little bit after a year, they leave. Why? Tell me more about it. This is such a fascinating thing to notice.
Yeah, I think it's something that was reflected to me when I was looking to join Enspiral, and I'll always be grateful to Dan Lewis, who invited me in. And one of the very early conversations over a cup of coffee was, he says, if you're going to do this, commit to giving it 2 years. He said, because people come in, and I think it is a case of either expectations aren't met, or it's not what they think it is, or there's not perhaps the engagement. I don't know. I think it's a myriad reasons for all sorts of different people. But this sense that you don't really get to know what the Enspiral experience is unless a certain amount of time has passed and you've engaged at a certain level within that time. And that really stuck with me. And I genuinely committed to myself to say, I'm going to give this 2 years. And so when I started to get involved and I went to some of the events and involved in some of the processes, and some of that frustration you mentioned, was really very present for me, and also reflected in some of the other people who were new at a similar time. So I knew it wasn't just me feeling this, it was other people feeling these frustrations as well. It was something where, within that time, it's okay, I'm going to stick in, I'm going to just see this through. And I would say it was a good 18 months to 2 years before some sense of that frustration started to drop away as I orientated into the space, as I think got a better understanding of what it is and what it isn't, and realized how much of that was baked into my expectations that I'd created from what I'd seen and heard. And also, I think that advice kept me connected even when I said, hey, I need to move to a higher orbit. I need to just not put so much energy in. I'm getting frustrated by some of the processes, but I need to just still stay attached, but watch. And then come back down again when something looks interesting. And I've been in Enspiral now coming up 4 years. So, and I would say it's really in the last 12 to 18 months that I kind of got a sense of what a long-term relationship with Enspiral might look like. But whilst at the same time, really being in a space now saying, well, has my evolution and Enspiral's evolution actually matched? And, I'm kind of curious over the next 6 months to a year to say, well, actually, is this still a space that I can serve and it serves me? Or maybe it served its purpose for me and it's time to move on. But I know it will have achieved much more for me having not made that choice at like 9 months in, when it's just like, I just can't cope with this. I'm heading for the hills, which I can imagine some people do, and I've seen some people do.
This is fascinating to hear, like this around 2 years mark, and I can imagine like this expectation thing, right? Because from the outside, like I guess it's not just with Enspiral, it's with any cool thing happening in the world. It's like seems like this, wow, it's so amazing, and you see the dream behind it and all the good stuff, but actually when you jump inside, you see all the all the messiness and all the chaotic part and all the shadow side, and you know that not everything is perfect, obviously, like everything has this shadow side. So I find it always fascinating to give this expectation and ask for commitment up front, like, hey, it's 2 years. You really have to ride it for 2 years. And it seems like your experience matched that. It's kind of similar for me as well in a way. I'm now more or less behind my 2-year mark, or kind of around it. And it's not that I felt like leaving, but I was not clear at all what is my role and like what is the purpose that Enspiral plays in my life. And now it's becoming clearer. It's like, okay. It makes sense that you need 2 years to get it. Why do
And
you
I think
think
that's
that is?
very, I was going to say, I think it's also very dependent on the person and their situation. I came into Enspiral wanting to pivot to work that was more meaningful. And so, I was very much arriving with I want to connect with people who are doing interesting work. I want to find opportunities to do interesting work, and I need to make it financially viable for myself as a freelancer. And I wonder how different the experience is if someone turns up saying, I'm already doing impactful work. I'm okay doing what I'm doing. I'm fully self-supporting, but I actually just want to connect to people who are doing similar stuff. And I wonder whether people with that lens perhaps land and connect more quickly, because again, the expectations are different. And when we see that outside face of Enspiral, and one thing I mentioned in the sort of guide I created is that some of that's historic. Some of that, the library of the internet means that we can see views of what Enspiral is and does from 10 years ago, which aren't necessarily the same as what it is now. And we can, with our own lens of what we want it to be, we can create a version of Enspiral that probably doesn't even really exist when we then join with this aspiration. I found, and it is like I found the people I want to be amongst, having come from a different way of being in work and in the world. It can, and I think there's something about arriving at an excitement that creates expectations. I'll come back to that word. I think it's one of the things that can really trip us up when we create expectations that aren't baked in the reality of what the situation is. Like you talk about, the messy stuff that we don't see.
Yeah, so leave as you said in the headline, leave your expectations at the door. Just show up as you are and be prepared to be surprised by what you might experience.
Yeah. Because I was interested in for you, what was the difference between the expectations you had when you came in and what actually was there when you landed?
That's a very good question. I was just super hyped. Like, oh my God, this is like such a great thing. And the handbook is mind blowing. And I was connected already to a couple of people in Enspiral. And, some of them I really found, like the ones I knew, I found them really like inspiring and like really amazing, and the work they're doing. So I was like, oh, wow, this is what to expect. Like there's just this amazing combination of people doing amazing things and I get access to them. This is incredible. And then I had an amazing onboarding experience. I think this made a tremendous difference to me. And also one thing for context is I joined after our first digital gathering because it was COVID time, so we couldn't gather in person. So I didn't have the physical component to it. And of course, meeting people online is a very different experience. So it was, and it almost felt like I didn't really get it. Like I'm the guy who loves documentation. I read all the handbook and I was with Uli in onboarding pod. He was like guiding me. We had this like bi-weekly or monthly session for half a year. and like, you know, lots of notes and like trying to really process this informational context of Enspiral, and I was diving into Lumio like, no, I'm gonna get it. You know, like I'm committed to get it. I'm gonna be there on Slack and participate and do whatnot. But it only actually clicked for me when I came to the physical gathering. I think this was like the game changer. Like I still felt it was not frustrating for me. Like I was still okay, you know, I can be there in this digital space, but it didn't click. And only after the gathering last summer in Portugal, it kind of clicked. It's like, getcha. Now I know. Now I can roll with it, and I'm still discovering what it's going to be its purpose. But in my personal life, but it always felt good though. You know, I never had a doubt that I want to leave. It was clear for me from the beginning that even if I'm not getting it yet, that eventually I will. So this part was, I guess, communicated well also from Uli and other people that were guiding me into it. Like, give it time, no rush, participate at a level that is appropriate. That's also like a big section that you wrote, and I guess it's this common pattern. No, a newcomer comes and I want to do everything, working groups, budgets, all the pods. No, don't do that.
And it really is almost like a pick your own adventure, you know, but it's hard to sometimes pick what that level is. I was fortunate that I was within a 2-hour drive of Wellington, which is kind of the heart of Enspiral in New Zealand. And so it was very easy for me to go to those in-person events. It was pre-COVID, and that had a huge impact. Actually just being in a physical space with people and just learning how Enspiral runs those spaces. I mean, for me, it was a completely different experience of being with other people, making choices, being heard, being seen, and learning to be vulnerable and open and drop some of that facade that I'd spent most of my life creating to be this person in work that I think I'm supposed to be. So there's a huge sort of personal journey that goes along, I think, for a lot of people who come in. And again, you know, there are people who come in and that's normal. I think there's people who come in who are drawn by the idea when it's not normal, and that's a learning as well, you know, and learning through that takes time, and then learning, well, what's the experience on the other side of that learning? And I think, you know, I still, you know, there's still ups and downs for me, you know. It's like but I know there's a network of people there who over time I've come to know a number of individuals that I know I can reach out to if I have a query or a question or a wondering about something, and that's been hugely valuable, and it feels like now, after that many years, I'm starting to be somebody that other people can reach out to. You know, I'm now here sharing this, and it's like, oh, almost like, where's that opportunity for me to be of value and serve the community that isn't just jumping into process? Because that just jumping into process can require a lot of energy, and not everybody has got the capacity or even perhaps, I wouldn't say the experience, because the idea is anyone can join in with any level of experience, but I think without the experience of what it means to be in a broadly non-hierarchical decision-making process, it can be quite draining to turn up and find you can go through this process for, you know, I don't know, 2-hour calls twice a week for 3 weeks and come out the other end with no decision. And it's like, what's going on here? You know, why did I just pour all this energy into this when suddenly it just feels so flat? And that's again, that's coming in with that lens. And I, you know, I'm certainly not saying that Enspiral is perfect and has got everything worked out. And, you know, and at times it can feel like it's just a place for people who are interested in experimenting to experiment. You know, and it's like, oh, is that the point? But that's the point for those people, you know. And again, it's this amorphous thing that I don't know, at the beginning, the idea that you couldn't define what Enspiral was, I was like, you know, that's just rubbish. Of course you can. It's just people don't want to commit to it. And it's like, now I think I think I see more that it is different things to different people, and it plays different roles in their lives. And you know, I'm still pivoting my work through connections with Enspiral. I have picked up work that has been really inspiring for me, you know. But it's not that the network found me work, or that I found network work in the network. It was just serendipity that some other newcomer who joined at the same time as me happened to meet someone who happened to mention something and happened to then put them in touch with me. You know, it's like, okay, but there was an Enspiral element in there. And certainly I have found that in certain spaces I've stepped into trying to do work for good, being attached to and associated with the Enspiral network has given me a credibility that I wouldn't have had otherwise. You know, it's given me an opportunity to be heard and show, hey, I can do something here for you. So very, very clear benefits for me I can map, but a lot of it is much more hard to pin down, kind of just a sense of a bunch of people who I enjoy spending time with, who I can connect on similar ideas about how to be in life.
Thank you for sharing. It's lands really deeply with me. And there's this part that also I found very like fascinating and deep in the guide that you wrote, which kind of connects to what you were sharing now, about this openness and connection, but it doesn't necessarily mean friendship. Would you like to unpack this a little further? Like, I found it like very like it landed deeply with me, and I think it's good to bring to the awareness, right? Because it is this space where you might experience, maybe for the first time for some people, like this really transparency and honesty and vulnerability in a kind of more worky context.
Yeah, and what I wrote about in the guide was a sense that I think for a lot of people, the only place they've experienced that is in really deep friendships in the past. So to turn up into a space and spend, say, 3 days at a retreat, really connecting deeply with people you've never met, you know, you can go away thinking those people are kind of your friends. And it's not, and I put it, it's not to say that they can't be your friends, but it's just recognizing that that's how it is, and it's an amazing experience. But maybe you won't see that person again for another 12 months until you come back to the same retreat. And that you know, maybe there'll be 2 or 3 of those cycles before you actually feel that you can reach out to that person and connect on a level that you'd start to call friendship. And it, again, it can be a little bit confusing. You know, I remember spending time with some people on, you know, in a pod, you know, talking about some really interesting stuff for about, I think it was 6 or 8 weeks. We had regular calls, and you felt like you're really connecting with these people deeply. And there was some sense of it continuing connection afterwards, little by little, but it gently petered out. And what I was aware of is that the people in that particular pod, and let's say this is not an indication of anything about the people, but those who already had seeded connections based on past Enspiral experiences were clearly continuing to feed this relationship. Whereas for me, a lot of it was the first bit of fertilizer into that relationship. And, you know, over time, you know, say in the next 10 years, there might be opportunities to refertilize those, you know, reconnect those relationships, and they would build. So it's kind of just, I think it's accepting that you go deep very quickly, but actually those connections are spread out over time quite a lot, so that it's not like turning up in a workplace where you might see somebody every week or every, you know, and then relationships build quickly. It's like a very slow burn, but it doesn't mean to say the relationships aren't very valuable and very worthwhile. But it sort of goes deep, and then there's a pause and a gap, and those people go back off to their existing networks that they've been building, and you can suddenly feel a little bit like, oh, where did everyone go? I thought we were getting on so great. And it's like, well, you did, and that's awesome. And when you go back again to the next retreat, you'll find it's exactly the same again. But you have to, again, it's that time element. I found it a very unique experience to be connecting with people at that level, and then having them always what felt like disappear on me. And then the next time you connect, which could be 18 months later, you're back to where you were and you're picking up and moving on again.
Yeah, this is such an important thing to like put a finger on and acknowledge. I guess there's a lot of containers in general, like retreat spaces or like short, intense experiences where it's just so easy to go deep very quickly. But yeah, then, you know, the experience is over. And even if you met a person that just like changed your life, it still takes time, right? It takes time to grow relationships. It takes time to build friendships. And it's this predictability of the rhythm that also Enspiral has by design, right? That we have these gatherings that we meet every year or twice a year. You keep coming, you keep coming, you keep coming. That's why it takes those couple of years, right? To actually go over this hoop and really connect deeply with people.
Yeah, and I know, you know, Enspiral has experimented with things like the pods, which is bringing groups of people together for a period of time. So, you know, my sense is that the network is aware that there's something, not something necessarily missing, but there's something more could be filling that space between retreats. You know, what is connecting people? And it'd be interesting to see how the nodes, if they become geographically located, create the opportunity for more regular connection that might help support those big spaces. Because, you know, for a lot of people, they may be able to go to one retreat once a year, or actually one retreat every 3 years, depending where they are in the world. And that's a really long gap. I was fortunate that I could go, you know, in my first full year, I was able to go to a winter retreat, a summer retreat, then a winter retreat, you know, before COVID hit. And it was like, oh, that was really good. But even then, I still was aware of those gaps. And it's like, well, what fills the gaps? And I'm really interested in what experiments continue to happen to try and build those connections at smaller group levels. You know, there are connections around, say, co-budget or decision making or other bits and pieces, but you know, what are the ones that bring people together around topics, around passions that they have, that might allow that intermediate level connection that could actually help grow the broader network. You know, I kind of think of Enspiral as this spider web with all the people on the nodes, and then the threads are growing brighter or dimming depending on what's happening, you know, and the whole thing is just pulsing. But I often have a sense that the general, when there isn't much happening, the general dimming is quite universal. And then there's a burst of activity and then it dims. And I wonder what it is that we could do, instigate, help, support, that would lead to going, it's brighter and it's brighter and it's brighter. You know, you have a pulse around an event, but maybe the dimming is only 30%, not 70%. Post-event. So, and I know, you know, in Europe, Rich and the crew are experimenting with, you know, slightly more sort of almost structured way based on the microsolidarity work of how do we actually do this. So I think the idea of the nodes popping up means there's going to be more experiments and more opportunities to learn. And I would say that could be one area which would really make a big impact for newcomers coming in, to be able to stay, have a reason and a purpose to stay more connected into a space that isn't necessarily about like a decision-making process. It's about just turning up and being with people. You know, and there's global calls once a month that happen or did happen. And I know engagement was often quite low on some of those types of things people have tried to do, and different people have tried different things. So again, experiments are ongoing, but I'm curious about which one's going to really catch light and fuel itself going forwards.
I love this visual representation of the web, and that kind of dims and lights up. It's like just, yeah, it really speaks to me. and I can almost see it like, those little connections. Nah, this one is brighter. No, it's all going dim. How can we revitalize it? It's interesting you mentioned that, and also in the context of Enspiral Europe. After I joined through like the European side of Enspiral, it was still before the nodes, and I joined kind of immediately a working group for doing that in Europe. So we had this bi-weekly call. Every 2 weeks we had a connection call, and it kind of morphed, but we kept this bi-weekly rhythm for 2 years. And it was kind of that, it was just like the attendance was really, sometimes it was like literally 3 people or 2. And sometimes it was like bigger, 10, 12, depending on the week. But it kind of served that purpose. And I remember that for me as a person that was just joining, this made a big difference. That, okay, wow, there's this space every 2 weeks that I can connect with these people and just hang out. And, there were different topics, different experiments. Some of them were more like worky and spiral governance, all that kind of stuff. Our node was forming, all these kind of things. We're trying to figure it out, how it could be. But lots of them were just fun and connection. And actually some of the most precious calls was just like being together. And I remember there was this one call that there was 3 of us, and we just laid down in silence for 40 minutes because we just needed that. And it was like my favorite call. It was like, your need was just met. Perfect.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I was wondering which of the ones that really were, bright for you in terms of experience of connection, and what's the commonality there.
Do you have any of your own experiences, like those kind of in between gatherings? Like, what are the things that really brighten up this web for you, whether like the whole thing or just parts of it?
I think there's a range of experiences I had. So for me, the pod experience was a very positive one whilst I was in it. And I would see the connections I made and the experiences I had are still with me, having an impact on me now and how I am. But I didn't find myself kind of drawn to then go, and where's the next one? And where's the next one? It was kind of an interesting, it didn't feel to me like a repeatable experience in a way, and maybe it shouldn't be. So that was one thing that worked, but I only did one. And I did a couple. And maintaining the energy in it was sometimes hard. But also for me, I think the strongest has been just individual connections. There was certainly 2 or 3 of us who were new at the same time, who would occasionally get together on a call, and sometimes just connecting with people who are like-minded is all you need to do, and it doesn't matter what the topic is. It's just coming together in a space. And I'd certainly say now I make a conscious effort to, not on a regular basis, but just periodically, to reach out to somebody who I have a connection with. And often it'll be because I've got a question, or there's something I've come across that's quite interesting, and say, hey, I'd love to jump on a call and just have a conversation about this. And often those are calls that then perpetuate another one a couple of months later. So to me, it's that been almost, if you like, what's giving it life for me is the one-on-ones, and there's no doubt that the impact of COVID and the pandemic and not being able to meet in person in that same way was significant. And now I've moved further away. So for me now it's a significant cost and time to fly down to Wellington. Not as much as someone from overseas, but it's still it's more of a barrier to connect in person. So, in a way, my relationship with Enspiral is changing from being one which is almost relying on the periodic 6-monthly in-person pulse to, actually, it's up to me to keep this alive. It's up to me to reach out and connect. And there's almost like a taking on of the responsibility as being mine. There's as I say that, I'm now realizing that's what's happened over the last couple of years. And why wouldn't it be my responsibility? It's no one else's responsibility. So that's become sort of a very organically, it's become a sort of a gentle evolution in what my relationship is. And I think that's where I see myself as perhaps at a slightly higher orbit. As I just go, when I can see what's going on, I'm in the Slack, I keep an eye. I don't read everything. I just monitor a couple of channels so I get a sense of what's going on. But I can also reach out to people, if there's something coming up that I want to talk to them about. And, I'd like to think that people feel able to reach out to me, but I wonder whether they know even what I'm doing, what I'm working on, and what perspectives I have. And that's kind of one of the things is, how would they? Because if I'm not sharing into those spaces, and even if you're sharing into, say, the Slack, there's probably only 30 or 40, I don't know what the total number is, 30 or 40 people regularly keeping up to date with what's in there. And if you don't happen to be looking at the same channels as I'm posting in, I would say easily 90 to 95% of the Enspiral network have no idea what I do. No idea where I am now, if this is where I was, and what value I could bring to a conversation if they felt the need to bounce an idea off me. And that's only really emerging as we talk. But it's like, that feels like there's a missed opportunity, really. And I know people have tried to have databases of members and other bits and pieces in the past, and tried to have regular global calls where people turn up and share, and none of those things have worked. So I'm really curious about why, and I keep mentioning that curiosity. It's like I'm involved in a couple of other communities, and digital communities, where it's like trying to connect people who have got similar interests, and it seems to require a lot of work to keep it alive. And I'm really interested in what it is that gives it its own life, gives it enough energy that it can keep going, and it's self-perpetuating. And what's the information flow required such that anybody in Enspiral can feel like they can DM me in Slack because they kind of have a sense of who I am, what my perspectives are, and they might just want to have a conversation. Yeah. And if that was possible for everyone, what would that change?
Those are, wonderful questions. And I guess like most communities try to sort this out. Like it's so fascinating because I don't know, like in so many different spaces, this idea always comes up, like we should have a database of people's current projects and skills, and then just always fails miserably. Because because it takes so much time and energy, and people move really fast, and we evolve so fast. And I know Rich had this perspective that kind of landed well with me, that you just need to meet in the gathering, and then you just get kind of this instant download of information, and where people are and what's happening, and that's it. You don't need to do anything else. It's done just by being there and connecting. So it's fascinating, but there's this part of me that sees this, like, how would our connection weaving and like just what we can create together as a network or as individuals that network can support, if we would actually know who to reach out to directly when we maybe don't have a specific question, right? Because, okay, maybe you have a specific question, you can put it on Slack, and maybe somebody gets back to you. And usually, I mean, most of the questions get picked up and people actually get responses or get what they need, which is for me like fascinating and beautiful. But like I wonder, like, what if you don't yet know what is the right question to ask?
Yeah, and I've been in spaces where I've been on a webinar with some other attendee, and the conversation's been so interesting. What they've shared is interesting. And them on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, I'd love to have a chat because what you were sharing really resonated with me." It's like, I didn't know what that was. I couldn't have gone and found them. It was just but the conversation has come as a result. And And I wonder, my sort of perspective 6 months ago was, almost like a global over. It's this job of this global thing. Excuse me, just as I turn my notifications off. From the sort of global top down, we set up structures so that people connect, to really realizing that actually needs to come from the other way. And as I'm learning about living systems design and the importance of place, it's like, I don't need to necessarily know who everyone in Enspiral is if I'm deeply connected to, say, the 8 people in my region. And some of those are connected to people in other regions, and some of those are connected to other regions. And so it's by proxy almost that I'm connected to everybody. Whereas at the moment, it almost feels like you've got the whole and you've got the individual, but there's this big gap in between. And I know that's some of what the microsolidarity of Rich's work is talks to. But I'm really sensing that with the nodes and space, it could be very different. I wonder how small those nodes could be. Because I think the sense is like, Enspiral Europe is a node. But what about Enspiral Barcelona? What about Enspiral, it's really small nodes, and what is the level at which suddenly you can start to get a regularity? Because I can see that connecting with people in my region would actually be possible physically, maybe once every 2 or 3 months. We could each drive for 2 hours and meet up for a lunch somewhere, and then does that once a year. We might get together with everyone in the country, and then once every, and what are the different levels? So there's definitely different layers to that, and I think it has to come from the bottom up, not the top down, which is a reversal of my understanding that's come about in the last 6 months, as I've kind of looked more to living systems as to what keeps a living system alive versus what keeps a community of connection alive.
And I really like connecting this whole idea with what you mentioned earlier, like this shifting the sense of responsibility for feeling connected to yourself, and not just kind of outsourcing it on the community. Like, yeah, sure, the community will maybe provide this rhythm of twice a year we have a gathering, and there's pods, and there's maybe an assembly sprint. Like, there are some spaces for you to participate, but really it's kind of up to you to get connected whenever you feel you're disconnecting. And some of the ways is kind of what you mentioned, right? Like, just reach out to a person that and say hi, and let's have a call. And yeah, if you happen to be in a physical proximity in the same region, makes it so much easier, right? Like, you can actually meet up, and then that opens the whole new level. I mean, it was always curious for me, like, coming from being in Europe, and quite, especially before Enspiral Europe node was created. I mean, yeah, we had some European energy, but there was always this like feeling of, there's this like faraway land where Enspiral, is active and people are meeting regularly. I don't know. I think it's some kind of, in my mind, there's like almost this vision that like Enspiral people in New Zealand just like hang out all the time, or like, I don't know, maybe because there was this time of having the shared office space and all of that. So it's funny also to realize that it's not necessarily that. And okay, if you live in Wellington and kind of centered around, sure, but if you're a bit further, it's maybe not that kind of proximity actually, and you still don't see the other people so often.
And I think there's a reality there that's really kind of important to name. Is I was close enough that once a month I was jumping on a bus and going down to Wellington and working in a co-space all day, and then coming back simply to connect with people, because I was trying to pivot. And it's like, and I would reach out to people and say, hey, I'm going to be down in the area, do you want to catch up for coffee? And so I had that opportunity to physically connect with Enspiral people. But people are busy. So even with that effort and energy, people would say yes, but actually it wasn't like you were turning up and then, I don't know, at this particular cafe there was 17 Enspiral people would always meet for lunch on a Friday. You know, that stuff wasn't happening. Yeah, so it was very much me kind of probing, I suppose, into that space and going, well, what's here that I can tap into? And finding that there wasn't really much there. You know, and often engagement, when you try and organize that, as I mentioned around some of the global Zoom calls, engagement can be really low. And I think it allowed me to kind of almost like debunk that myth that just go to Wellington and Spa is buzzing, you know, because it was awesome to turn up and go to like a monthly Enspiral meeting that was in person at the Dev Academy. But sometimes there might only be 6, 10, 12 people there, you know, and again, once COVID came along, that went online and it changed and didn't have so much energy. It felt like people were having to put a lot of energy in to make those things happen, and it didn't feel sustainable. And I think that's turned out to be the case. So, yeah, who knows what it will become? But yeah, really good to say that that's the experience in New Zealand, even in Wellington, can be almost as isolating. And I think that's when you turn up into something like that, it can be a surprise. But I also think that it depends on the different people. You know, some people want to be super connected. Some people just want to touch base every now and then. Some people just want to be lightly associated with Enspiral, and all levels are okay. But it can take a little while to understand that all levels are okay, and there's still value in being there, even if all you do is, I don't know, read a newsletter once a month. That's all you do. Even if you don't do that, you just see the newsletter turn up in your inbox, and that's all you do. You're still connected, and it still has value into the network.
And the invitation is always there, right? Like, I think this is important to name, that even if you choose not to take the step or put the energy and take this responsibility for generating this feeling of connection and like lighting up the web again, yeah, the invitations are there, and there's quite a few different ways that anyone can really engage with Enspiral outside of the gathering space, right? Which is kind of a different context almost.
Yeah,
maybe that's why it takes 2 years.
Yeah, and always a welcome. You know, like you say, and the invitation is always there to step in or step out. And you know, I've met various people who have been at some points really heavily engaged, and other points that are what I call a higher orbit, and then but just watching, you know, still connected but not gone, and then have come back into greater connection over time when the time was right for them. And so much of it, I think, is about, you know, what is your capacity as an individual to engage? What is your capacity for this type of work, which can be, you know, in terms of the governance of Enspiral, can be really messy and frustrating at times. And whilst also I can see for those people who love that, it can be really rewarding and exciting. And yeah, it takes time to find what it is for you, or even to find that Enspiral isn't for you. And that's okay too. You know, this is not it's an answer for everybody all the time forever. It's just kind of turn up. What is the experience you're having? Does that serve you? Are you bringing value and receiving value? Is there a value exchange in that relationship? And if not, fine. You know, it's almost an odd thing to arrive and then think, well, but I'm thinking of leaving, but no one seems to notice that I'm thinking of leaving. It's like, that's a really kind of egocentric approach that someone would even notice that I've gone. And it's like, yeah, but that's a good thing that people can come and go that freely without disrupting things. Though it can be a bit of a challenge personally to think that you know, it talks so much to, you know, self-worth and ego and all the other bits and pieces that so many of us struggle with. The idea of that saying, yeah, but you know, 1 minute I'm here doing this, that, and the other, and next minute I'm thinking going, and no one's even going to notice. No one's even going to reach out and ask. It's like that's just my stuff. Spiral doesn't need to deal with that.
I really love how you're framing it, and yeah, like this relationship, like yeah, it's okay to leave and come in, and it's kind of your own sense of ego, and if you don't let people know that you're thinking of leaving, how would they know? And right, it was what you were mentioning before, like if you don't let people know what you do and what you need and what you're working on, how would they know unless they happen to be on your friends level and have like already different ways of connecting with you, right? So at the end of the day, it comes down to, I guess, you as an individual taking the kind of proactive care to participate and show up in any way, or not show up, or just kind of lurk and see what's happening, and read the newsletter, or just know that it's coming, knowing that the invitation is there, and if it also stops being worthwhile, then you can also leave. And even if nobody notices, that's maybe not because you're not being valued. It just, like, yeah, the network continues existing, and it's kind of a loose network in that sense. Even if like the strength of it maybe is precisely in that looseness and flexibility and adaptability and change.
And there's, as you say that, I'm sort of almost reminded of some of the almost like the rules we apply to these types of spaces that don't necessarily apply or don't need to apply. Like someone needs to notice when I'm in and when I'm out. Why? If I'm there at an event, then I'm there, and if I'm not, I'm not. It's and I think for somebody coming in new, there's a nuance in that can, as I mentioned before, it can be confusing. I had an analogy that came out of some conversations with some other newcomers a while back, which was the idea of one of these big old brick viaducts that spans a valley with the big arches. And when you turn up new to Enspiral, you're here looking at one of the brick pillars, and all you can see is bricks and a few cracks, and the mortar needs dealing with. You can't see the bridge, and so you're trying to talk to people who've been there a long time about the bricks, and about the bricks need attention, and this is not working, and this is really frustrating. But they're stood way back up the valley, seeing the arches and how the bricks fit together, and going, the arches look good, or even further back, they can see the bridge, and they can see it's spanning between, and it's doing its job. So sometimes those conversations are happening from such a different perspective that even the same words don't mean the same things, and that can be quite confounding. And it was a really nice analogy for me to realize, isn't it? Oh, right, yeah. Giving it time means I drift back, and I can start to see, oh, okay, this is more than just bricks. This is bricks forming arches, and over time I can see these arches come together to form a bridge, and it's a whole structure that operates at a very different scale to the one I was seeing when I turned up, met with some people, and talked to them one-on-one, because there's this bigger thing that it's part of that I just can't see and don't understand.
The importance of taking a step back and shifting perspective, and what am I not seeing as I look at the thing?
And the things I'm sort of pointing at and judging based on my lens with my limited perspective, they're not necessarily relevant or important to other people. And I think, again, that depends on what place you're at in your journey towards, decentralized governance, doing work for good, and so forth. And I think the further along that journey you are, when you then join into Enspiral, the more sense it would make, I think, immediately, because you would have a language for what you're seeing and what you're experiencing. That it was all new to me, and so I just didn't have the language. I didn't understand what, you can read all the books in the world, but actually, unless you're in a space where decentralized decision making, group decision making is happening in a very different way, it's an experiential thing, and unless you actually experience it, you can't then start to sort of piece together what it means for you and how you relate to that. Again, it comes back to that time and the importance of, if at all possible, getting into that physical space with people, because that really does amplify the experience so much.
And I guess the kind of what wraps it up for me, and it's like the one of the first sections of the guide that you wrote, is that like this fact that Enspiral is purpose agnostic, and like it's about people who do good in the world or do meaningful work, but what that actually means can be just so different. So it almost it's almost like the DNA of Enspiral is this multifaceted, different perspectives coming together, and that really implies for me that people will just not behave as I would expect to, or see things completely differently. And I see something and it's like, but this is the most important thing, how can you not see that? It's like, no, it's fine. Don't worry about that. What? How can I not worry about that? And this is by design. It's fine. Like, it's this was always the fascinating part for me about Enspiral. Like, and it seems like a very common one to like almost identify Enspiral and to introduce it to other people. Like this one, from my experience at least, it's the one that comes up the most. Like, there's like the purpose is kind of vague deliberately, and it means different things for different people. What? What does it mean? Well, I don't know. I can tell you what it means for me, but it's just for me, just so you know.
Yeah, and it's okay for you to hold your individual perspective on that, because I can remember being at a retreat, and all the lights were being left on. And at that point in time, I was, reasonably focused in my own life about energy use and so forth, and I couldn't understand why all the lights were being left on all the time. And it was just a really neat conversation with Josh in the kitchen. It's like, no, it's purpose agnostic, just whatever your version is of doing good in the world, as long as it's broadly acceptable to the network as a whole, it's okay. And and I wrote the guide really because it was what I feel I would have needed to read when coming in, and it would have helped just dismantle those expectations and those misunderstandings, and tell me you're feeling confused because it is confusing, and you're feeling this can't be defined because it's not defined, but that's okay, and it'll be defined when it needs to be, but not beforehand. So it was very much a kind of, whilst it was still fresh enough for me, in a way, it lost the energy of the frustration enough that I could actually put it into words that were useful. But whilst it was still fresh enough for me, it's like, actually, this would be really nice as something I can contribute to say, if that was there, if I'd read that before I joined, it would have saved me a whole bunch of frustration, and I'm not sure I would have ended up anywhere different, but I think it would have been a more comfortable journey along the way. And maybe that would allow people to stay in, and get value from and give value to networking, whatever capacity they have, rather than feeling it was a certain thing or they didn't fit or whatever else. So I'm hoping it will be useful to people over time, and it'll be interesting to see other people evolve it with their own experiences as they come in, and definitely as we shift to the node model, because there's so much opportunity, I think, for different onboarding experiences to occur, as you experienced was something very clearly different to what I experienced. And I think What I'd love to see go, though, is almost I came across an attitude of almost like, it was like a sink or swim attitude, which was, well, if you don't get it and you're feeling frustrated and you can't stick it, then it's not for you. And I didn't buy into that. You know, I think there were a lot of people who came into Enspiral with really good intentions, really good aspirations, weren't able to connect, but perhaps could have done. And I think we lose out when people who are aligned aren't part of the network. I think there's a you know, yeah, we don't necessarily notice when one person goes, but you know, if there's a general, there's more people leaving than there are joining, we're kind of on a limited timeline, and I'd love to see Enspiral be growing, because it feels like the number of people who are wanting to step into this type of work and step into this type of space is growing, and it would be nice that Enspiral continue to be part of that, if that is relevant. Maybe there's something beyond which evolves, which is more relevant. I don't know.
I feel like that's a beautiful dream, and kind of, yeah, a good point to wrap up our conversation. To just like, yeah, leave this wish and desire. And I'm so grateful that you wrote this guide. It really hit me like in this beautiful way, and it felt like, yeah, the way how you articulated this confusing process. And also, like, I love this proactivity, right? It's something that always attracted me to Enspiral, and it was pointed out at me specifically, like, if you see something that can be improved, go for it. Like, you have permission to improve things, and it feels like this was this very meaningful contribution that you created. So thank you so much for it. Really appreciate that.
No, thank you. And yeah, no, I appreciate the feedback. It certainly it took a little bit for me to not need the permission. Again, part of that learning along the way. So it's nice that there's something I can contribute, and it's a value for as long as it's a value. So yeah, it's been great talking to you.
Great talking to you.